Welcome, everyone. The U.S. Gulf Coast is already a world-class hub. This industrial center for oil and gas and chemicals has large-scale production and demand, well-established infrastructure, and a skilled workforce. What would it take to do that again for hydrogen? That is what we are here to discuss today. We have leading voices from oil and gas and hydrogen industries, as well as policy influencers from universities, government, and labor. These experts will be covering the following topics in 4 panels: how to leverage existing infrastructure, the Department of Energy's $8 billion hydrogen hub program, the important need for customers for hydrogen, and how public-private partnerships can be used to advance hydrogen in the Gulf Coast. My name is Carol Battershell. I helped organize this workshop. I am a distinguished associate at the Energy Futures Initiative. I worked 25 years for BP, starting as a refinery engineer and departing as a vice president working on hydrogen, carbon sequestration, solar, and wind. I moved from industry to government and worked on energy policy under Secretary Moniz. I now have the privilege and challenge to introduce Secretary Moniz, who probably does not need an introduction and has too many accomplishments to fit into the time allowed. And he wants me to cede the floor to him quickly so he can speak to the over 300 of you who registered for the workshop. Our host, Dr. Moniz, is the CEO and founder of Energy Futures Initiative. He is also the CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. He served as the 13th Secretary of Energy and negotiated the historic Iran nuclear agreement alongside the Secretary of State. He was also a key architect of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change and Mission Innovation at COP21. Before becoming the Secretary of Energy, he was the head of the MIT Physics Department and founded the MIT Energy Initiative. Secretary Moniz?
Well, thank you, Carol. And I thought for a second there you were going to spare me any biographical description, but in any case, let's move ahead. I'll be very brief. I just want to say that in kicking off this workshop, that the Energy Futures Initiative, EFI, has been developing a multi-part hydrogen formation effort for some time now. Our first major report was on what the investment community thinks about hydrogen, and this was derived from more than 100 current and prospective investors in hydrogen. And we certainly found significant interest, but we also saw that a lot is needed to animate real commercial scale investment. We also saw that the realities of small scale lead to some choices that might not reflect longer range plans if a large multi-sectoral market develops. So we have to get from here to there. And of course, the Hydrogen Hub program, seeded by the infrastructure bill, has created a stir. Second, we followed that up with a series of regional workshops to understand from the bottom up what certain communities and key stakeholders are doing in clean hydrogen and what policies may be needed to activate a clean hydrogen market. Today's workshop is the third in that series, following one in the Ohio River Valley, which we performed with our Labor Energy Partnership, our partners being the AFL-CIO, and then one focused on the Carolinas. We published summary reports for each, as we will do today, based on today's workshop as well. Each of these regional workshops focus on specific aspects of a region's existing interest in hydrogen, industries, political leaders, local communities, and its current and potential resources that could support hydrogen market growth. These factors are especially relevant and significant in the U.S. Gulf Coast, where a large portion of the U.S. hydrogen industry operates today. To that end, we will hear from a distinguished group of moderators and panelists with firsthand knowledge of the region's current hydrogen activities, or from key thought leaders who may have insight on what's needed to start the clean hydrogen engine in the United States and the region. A few of the big questions we hope to address today include: how can the Gulf Coast leverage its existing hydrogen infrastructure and workforce to support hydrogen market formation? How can the incumbents' experience with hydrogen project permitting and regulation inform broader regional market development? What opportunities exist for DOE hydrogen hubs to create the basis for broader hydrogen market formation? I'll just add that in addition to these two parts of the program, in parallel, we are well along in an analysis of hydrogen market formation that will benefit from these first two phases, and with a focus on North America. And then we anticipate going further and extending the analysis internationally, where some new issues will certainly arise, for example, in long distance hydrogen transport. So that gives you an idea of our overall program and where this workshop fits in. It's very important to us. We look forward to the discussion. And with that, I'll turn things over for the first panel to launch. Thank you. I think that's Ken to take over.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Arnie. Appreciate it. I was just trying to get past the technical hurdle. Yeah, as Arnie mentioned, we're going to kick things off today talking about the Gulf Coast specifically and how it might be well positioned to leverage its already existing hydrogen infrastructure and the massive industrial base and workforce that exists in the region. You know, the region between, just by itself, between Corpus Christi and Sabine Pass on the Texas Gulf Coast is home to about 2/3 of the nation's existing hydrogen infrastructure. So when we talk about creating a market, we have to recognize first that a market actually already exists. It's just not a deep or liquid market. It's one that's really heavily characterized by producers and consumers engaged in bilateral contracts for sales of hydrogen that's often produced on site where it's ultimately used. I think what we're really talking about today is how do we actually expand that? How do we actually grow that to a point where clean hydrogen is more than just a feedstock for other processes, but it's actually a commodity in its own right, and you know, that may be a little loose, but something that is used as an energy carrier above and beyond what it's used for today. I am joined today by Simon Moore from Air Products, Delanca Simone from Energy Transfer, and Colette Honorable from Reed Smith. I'm going to spare everybody reading the bios. They're long, and we'd run out of time very quickly if I did so. Unfortunately, Jill Ivanko from Chart Industries was going to join us as well this morning, but she was unable to because she is somewhere roughly at about 35,000 feet above us, stuck on a plane because of a delay. So with that, I want to just jump right into the conversation and just kind of frame something that hopefully each of you can you know, sound off on. In particular, you know, I mentioned that there's a lot of hydrogen infrastructure already in place along the Gulf Coast. And each of you has a different touch point with that, which I think will make this conversation fascinating. I wonder if as we sort of get things started, if you could just kind of sound off a little bit, and I'll start with you, Simon. What do you think it's going to take to really see a hydrogen market grow and expand, given the existing infrastructure that's already in place and the workforce that's already in place in the Gulf Coast?
Well, great, Ken. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to Energy Futures Initiative and the rest of the panelists today for this exciting conversation. And Ken, I want to thank you because you acknowledge that there is hydrogen today. Hydrogen is a tremendous growth opportunity for everybody. There are challenges in that growth opportunity, but it is not a new concept. It is here today. Quite frankly, we operate the world's largest hydrogen pipeline network in the US Gulf Coast, about 1,000 kilometers, 20 sources of hydrogen, many, many customers. And I thought maybe the way I could try to bring some perspective to this is to share with folks what it was that allowed us, Air Products, our board, to get comfortable announcing last October a $4.5 billion low carbon hydrogen project in Louisiana. We're leveraging our infrastructure, we're leveraging the pipeline. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about that. Basically, it's a natural gas-based project, which uses a technology that enables the ability to capture over 95% of the CO2, which will be sequestered, about 5 million tons a year. It'll provide very low carbon hydrogen for our pipeline network customers, but it was also take some of that hydrogen and convert it to ammonia to be exported for the transportation market. We have committed to that project. It's a real project, full speed ahead. And so I guess what I'd say is we've committed $4.5 billion. Now, why do we choose Louisiana? It's not the only place we're doing projects. We're doing a project in Canada, in Saudi, and California, but we've been in Louisiana for 50 years. We know it's got an excellent, well-trained workforce who understands how to operate these types of facilities. It understands the workforce has an opportunity to participate in the energy transition. We were able to leverage our existing hydrogen pipeline infrastructure. As is pointed out, you don't need a new pipeline for lower carbon hydrogen. The hydrogen molecule doesn't know what color it is. You can use that existing infrastructure. We have customers, some of who are on the phone today. Many of you know who they are, but they're the refining chemical petrochemical companies who are absolutely focused on reducing their own carbon footprint. And one of the ways they can do that is to access lower carbon hydrogen. One of the most exciting things is what Louisiana offers from a carbon capture standpoint. And there's two parts to that. There's the geology, right? You've got to have the right geology and the right infrastructure, and that exists in Louisiana in a very large way. But to complement that, you have to create the legal, regulatory, and business framework that allows companies like us to be comfortable making these $1 billion of investments with a multi-decade return horizon. And we were very pleased, Louisiana Mineral Board, and the ability to secure a contract that would give us the right to sequester that CO2. So in summary, those are the reasons why we're spending $4.5 billion on a project in Louisiana.
Thanks, Simon. Delanca, before I get to you, I want to say something because I think maybe you'd be able to pick up on this, and then Colette, certainly you will be able to, given your background as well. Simon, you mentioned effectively the development of a supply chain, which is what is really needed for hydrogen to expand. There is already, of course, an existing supply chain, but the added elements, of course, of carbon capture. If you're thinking about going from gray to blue, just to use the trite color scheme, right? But you're absolutely right. I mean, a hydrogen molecule is a hydrogen molecule. It doesn't, the pipeline doesn't care, the infrastructure doesn't care where it comes from. But with regard to the development of that infrastructure, that, from the work that I've been involved with, seems to be one of the most challenging aspects of this, because, and this is not unique to hydrogen, by the way, what I'm saying, but infrastructure development just generally, and thinking about how we expand things to cross state borders and even engage in international trade, I think is something that we're going to have to do pretty vigorously over the next 5 years if we want to see this market really grow. Delanca, given that and given what you've done at Energy Transfer, I wonder if you could chime in there and really talk about your experience and your view and what you guys are doing in this space.
Sure. Thanks, Ken, and thanks for having me. Indeed, just the U.S. Gulf Coast, as been mentioned earlier, has all the elements to kind of further expand the existing hydrogen network and grow into the clean hydrogen space. And this, of course, includes the existing infrastructure that gives us a great starting point. Now, but as you alluded to earlier, Ken, what's happening is the sources and the uses of hydrogen are expanding, right? And it'll evolve just like some other commodity markets has over time, from a more bilateral producer customer base business to a more open access infrastructure network. And our view is that it will need additional pipeline storage and terminal capacity to complement the existing infrastructure. The company I work for, Energy Transfer, is one of the largest energy infrastructure companies in the US. We own, operate gathering long-haul transport, as well as processing plants, storage facilities, and export terminals. And we have seen the startup and advent and maturing of various hydrocarbon-based energy commodities over the last few decades. Now, our pipeline network is already connected to most of the industrial areas in the US Gulf Coast, where we supply our customers with energy and industrial feedstock like natural gas, crude oil, ethane, propane, etc. Now, this same network then could be quite useful, we think, to transport new forms of energy like hydrogen, renewable fuels, as well as support the infrastructure required for decarbonizing the industrial sector by enabling carbon capture projects. Now, this can be done where possible to safely repurpose pipelines and by utilizing existing right-of-ways, as well as, of course, our expertise in building, operating in this sector. The reality, though, is that permitting and building this infrastructure takes time. And this is, again, where the existing infrastructure that Simon alluded to comes into play. So our approach has been to kind of identify and work with customers that are engaged in this evolving market, and to see where we can start, maybe small, but quickly, but with an eye to how we can kind of, build that can scale in the future. Again, our expertise in having done this for other commodity markets kind of helps, in addition, of course, to our existing infrastructure. But the key thing is these things essentially take time, right? So this coordination of the new sources of hydrogen, whether it's blue hydrogen through CCS or green hydrogen, and everything in between, that'll have to get developed along with the midstream sector, as we call it, the transport storage sector, as the use cases evolve as well.
Thanks, Solanka. I'm glad you leaned in on the coordination problem. That's core to my own work in this space, and really every energy commodity market that I'm involved in. But you mentioned the development of new infrastructure for expansion, using existing right-of-ways, repurposing infrastructure, developing new infrastructure. Simon, you mentioned the legal and regulatory issues that are going to have to be resolved as we see expansion. And I think that's a perfect segue for Colette, you to dive in. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Ken. Great to be here with you. This is a great day, and I want to give a better view, I guess, to complement what Ken and Simon have spoken about why the Gulf Coast. The Gulf Coast, because we have a number of experts who have been doing this work and doing it well for decades, as you've heard already. And there are over 1,600 miles of hydrogen infrastructure that exists today in the Gulf Coast. That's why the Gulf Coast #1. So we have an existing infrastructure, we have the experts, we have the workforce in Senator Landrieu's world, as we've learned, and I saw Alan's note in the chat about what's happening in Lafayette. Now we need to align the regulation and the policy drivers to support this work. And I was really pleased to hear Delanka reference energy storage. By way of reference, I'm a former state utility regulator and a former commissioner at FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And our role there was to hear applications for energy projects, Ken, to your point, that cross state lines. But FERC does not regulate hydrogen pipeline infrastructure development. PHMSA regulates the safety of hydrogen pipelines. So to Simon's point, we really need to now align policy and regulation with where the puck is going to be so that we can all skate there. Policy and regulation will provide certainty. It will provide the rules of the road, if you will. But like our work at FERC with the development of energy storage, regulators and policy can really help to remove barriers to entry. To Simon's point, we really want to incent the kind of investment that they've made, $4.5 billion. That's incredible. And we know of the many uses of hydrogen and how it can be used as a carrier and a source of energy. So now if we are able to align the policy with the need that we have to create this market, to support public-private partnerships, you're going to hear in the next session about the great work at DOE and how we can tap that. I would say finally, Ken, we need for these experts like Simon and Delanca and others to engage with regulators. We don't bite. In fact, we want to help. So we want to help align the policy and the mandates with ways that will support the development of this growing industry. In fact, an estimate shows the potential of 16% carbon dioxide emission reduction by 2050, as well as 150 billion in revenues and 700,000 jobs by 2030, if we can really capitalize on hydrogen. So we have the table really set well for us in the Gulf Coast, and now we need to leverage the experiences of these great minds and innovative experts to help us drive policy where it needs to go.
I'm glad you referenced the economic implications, and certainly for the Gulf Coast region, which is home to a lot of oil and gas production, quite frankly.
Absolutely.
And that is something that hydrogen could really stand to benefit, because you can use oil and gas currently, but oil longer term, as a feedstock for hydrogen production. And if you can see that market really grow, it really is a game changer regionally. And not only does it create additional jobs, but it preserves jobs in existing or incumbent industries. And that raises a really important point that I'd love for each of you to address. There are a lot of proposals for new hydrogen projects. Simon, it's good to see that y'all have actually committed to moving forward with cleaning a hydrogen project by effectively attaching CCS to it and expanding the production of hydrogen. But the proposals ultimately are nice, but execution is really where the bread is buttered, so to speak. So given the legal and regulatory issues that are confronting the space, given the commercial hurdles that confront it, we're all very aware of those. How do we actually move from a position where we're not just talking about proposed projects or pilots, and we're talking about commercial scale activity? Is it going to be that something that's more regional, so state by state, and then ultimately, avails itself to connecting across state lines? And the model I have here in mind is the way utility scale power generation developed initially, and then we had long distance transmission to arbitrage differentials between regions. Do you think the hydrogen market might do something like that? Or in other words, is the market going to run out in front of policy, or do you think policy is going to stand ready to catch up? And I know I threw a lot on the table there, but maybe we'll go in a different order. Delanca, I'll start with you on this one. If you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it.
Sure. I think it's useful to kind of look at some other markets that have developed, Ken, and I know you spend a lot of time kind of thinking about this. The way these kind of hub concepts in any other commodity gets typically developed is by one piece of infrastructure getting connected to another piece of infrastructure, storage infrastructure developing a terminal, and them getting connected. It's not where a whole group kind of aligns on, oh, here's the master plan, now let's go execute against it. It's not that coordinated. Unfortunately, that's just the reality of it. I think the way we see it growing from here is leveraging on the existing infrastructure that there is available today, kind of bespoke projects like the one Simon mentioned, getting started from a production perspective, but then maybe some terminals to kind of complement that, some storage facilities to complement that, and get some of those started. I'll use storage as an example. So these are very rough numbers, but to get any kind of salt storage kind of permitted, depending on the state, etc., can take 6 to 12 months, right? To get that permitted. And then from there onwards, if drilling and leaching it takes another 18 to 24 months. So what can you do to kind of get some of this infrastructure started, but keeping some of the flexibility, maybe to, if hydrogen storage doesn't work out, you can use it for another product, but you don't wait for the demand case to develop fully before you start the process, because that's like a 2-3 year process, right? So where can you get the process started, maybe getting the permitting started for dual use, and then as the market develop, then you're building it almost kind of in parallel. What are the kind of the low regret things that you can do now? Of course, the clean hydrogen market is evolving, right? So green hydrogen is perhaps not so economically kind of competitive there yet. So it's difficult to kind of take a build and they will come kind of approach either. But at the same time, if you want to accelerate it, you can't wait for the signal to be super clear. So it's somewhere in between. But our kind of tentative thought is that you just get started where you have some levers to kind of layer into the space, start getting some of the planning work done to complement some of the other work going on across the value chain.
Thanks, Dilanka. Colette, I'm going to go to you, and then Simon, I'll get you to kind of wrap up on this question. But I wonder if you could expand on what Dilanka said, Colette, and even bring in, how do you see the regulatory space evolving over the next 5 to 10 years in this arena?
Thank you, Ken. I'm so delighted you called on me second. I couldn't wait to jump in and add to what Dilanka has stated. Number one, we already have players, particularly in the energy space, who were thinking and moving in this direction. Dilanka is referencing this work. I have a number of clients that are already thinking about how to leverage existing infrastructure, blend in a little hydrogen, because companies are thinking about it not only to continue to be efficient, innovative, but a number of key sectors are focusing on their own goals and how to meet the demands of shareholders, of customers, et cetera, Wall Street, et cetera. So number one, it's happening. We're already in the middle of it. Number two, I should say, I think the regulators, as usual, are going to have to catch up here and catch up quick. We saw Congress really starting to explore the idea of who's going to regulate in this space. As I mentioned, PHMSA oversees safety, not siting, not construction, not what's in the public interest. That's a role of the energy regulator. So I would suggest that FERC clearly has a solid role to play here. FERC has exercised this mandate with regard to not only LNG, natural gas, hydro, and other projects over the years, but with a mandate from Congress could easily jump in here. It's staffed with hundreds of experts, scientists, planners, yes, lawyers, and others who can help wade through this issue. But it will take this Gulf Coast sector in particular, informing that process, informing the regulatory and rulemaking process, and even the legislative process about what is needed in the regulator to make sure that it's not too much regulation, that it's just right, and that it is a proper platform to address and provide guidance about how to proceed with this terrific opportunity and innovation, but also in a way that provides certainty and addresses cost-related issues, which will be well handled in the sector, as a number of them are privately funded primarily.
I'm glad you mentioned legislative directive, and I'm also glad you mentioned certainty. Those are two things that would do wonders for any industry, and certainly for hydrogen. Simon, since you guys are about to put steel on the ground, I'd love to hear you sort of chime in on this as well.
Great. Maybe one, I would say tactical but important point, and then a second broader point. So carbon capture, again, complement to the Mineral Board, state of Louisiana. We were able to sign a contract where we have the rights to sequester that carbon. That's critical. We can't build a project without being confident in that. I think there's perhaps an opportunity, Class 6 EPA wells that are permit that is required for that. I think there's perhaps an opportunity to focus on making the approval of those permits a little bit more quick. Perhaps Louisiana has the opportunity to do that. I think we're all aware of that opportunity. But clearly, carbon capture plays a role, and you can't have a critical permit take 6 years to get, or it's not going to work. So that's I think, a very tactical but critical opportunity. And then I think more broadly, quite frankly, our view is really to consider focusing on the demand side. I mean, I know we're doing our project, but at the end of the day, smart people, smart companies know how to make hydrogen. They know how to make it in a low carbon way. That will happen. I think supporting the demand side, and if I could for a second, we think California's low carbon fuel standard actually works pretty well because it does not dictate production methodology. It doesn't care how you make it. It focuses on a lower carbon fuel. And that's actually what we're all about. We need the energy. We need it at a lower carbon basis. So creating the demand for it, transportation demand is an incredible opportunity for hydrogen, heavy transportation. We're very focused on that market. We do see governments around the world who are putting in place demand creating mechanisms, particularly in Europe, particularly in California, perhaps in the Northeast. So I think in a broader scheme, I guess my message would be is, I think regulatory bodies focusing on creating the demand side, I think will create that certainty, which will allow the investment to happen.
Excellent. Thanks, Simon. I'm glad you raised demand. Of course, you need demand. I mean, this gets into the whole coordination theory idea, right? You need demand at one end of the supply chain and production at the other, and then all the things in between that connect it up. And that process needs to develop smoothly if you want to see steady growth. It's critical for economies of scale to be reached. And that really gets to, there was a question that came through in the chat, and given that we're almost out of time and I'm going to have to cede the floor to Charles, I wonder if you could, in 30 seconds or less, and it could be a simple yes or no, comment on whether or not you see that scale developing to a point where ultimately the cost of hydrogen to a commercial or a residential consumer would be at a level that is comparable to what DOE has stated as a target, which is approaching that $1 a kilogram mark sometime in the next 10 to 15 years. I'll start with you, Colette, on this one.
I think we have to do all of the things that we've been talking about here on this call in order to have a real shot at it. I'm not going to give you a yes or no question. Heck, I'm a lawyer at the end of the day. But in my last few minutes, let me also say, Simon, I'm so glad you mentioned permitting. We've got to get that right. We've got to streamline that process and shorten that time. But to answer, was it Charles's question or someone's question? We have to walk and chew gum at the same time if we have even a shot to meet that goal.
Simon?
Yeah, I'd say this, everybody is aware that the current cost mechanisms don't really fairly value oil and gas today. And I appreciate some of you may have a different opinion, but obviously there's no penalty for the CO2 that's emitted. And at the end of the day, whether this is a stick or a carrot, once you put an appropriate cost through some mechanism on the CO2 that's emitted from today's scenario, then yes, I think you can have a very competitive future hydrogen energy transition.
Delanca?
Yeah, no, I always looking at kind of analogies, right? Like I said earlier, now we've been through kind of this journey in the PV space over the last kind of 20 years. So it's quite plausible that cost decreases and efficiency at scale brings clean hydrogen, relatively competitive stage.
Excellent. Well, Simon, Delanca, Colette, thank you for joining me with this discussion. I think it was excellent. We could go on and on. I feel like we've scratched the surface on about 1,500 different topics that we could spend a lot of time on, but I have to cede the floor now. Charles Bustani, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Ken, and it's really good to be with you, and what a terrific panel you guys just had, looking at the attributes on the Gulf Coast that are basically in place to create a market, but also some of the challenges that exist in market formation. So this panel, we're going to shift gears a bit, and we're going to look at what opportunities exist for the Department of Energy hydrogen hubs to create the basis for a broader hydrogen market formation. You heard earlier in this discussion that the Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, which set up an $8 billion funding stream in the form of grants to go toward the creation of these hydrogen hubs. So key questions arise. How can these hydrogen hubs be designed and program to establish a foundation for broader market formation. My name is Charles Bustani. I am a former member of Congress and currently a partner at Capitol Counsel, a Washington firm, but I also represented in Congress for 12 years coastal Louisiana. And so I have a pretty good handle on what's going on down here in this area in Louisiana. But I'm joined today by three terrific expert panelists. Jason Beckfield is the Roger G. Stone Professor of Sociology at Harvard University. Jason has had extensive research experience and teaching experience looking at social stratification, political sociology, population health, and climate change. Jason is currently leading investigations of the sociology of energy transitions in the Gulf Coast region. Janice Lynn is the founder and president of Green Hydrogen Coalition, and also the founder and CEO of Stratagen. She brings two decades of experience advising a diverse range of clients in clean energy strategy and market development. And then thirdly, Brett Perlman is with us. Brett is the CEO at the Center for Houston's Future, where he is looking at critical issues that Houston is facing going into the future from market development and industry. He brings senior experience in government business, community service, government services, 4 years as commissioner of the Public Utility Commission in Texas. So I want to welcome all three of you to this panel. And these are critical questions. What is the role of public policy, and specifically these hydrogen hubs that are going to be created with a finite amount of money? How can we really catalyze market formation? So let's start first with Janice. How do you see the design of these hydrogen hubs based on your experience, and how critical is that design to catalyzing market formation?
Thanks, Charles. I really appreciate the opportunity to join such an esteemed panel today. Specifically, on your question about the role of policy and how do we jumpstart market formation, the prior panel covered it well. And I just want to recap that in part, it's about accelerating the infrastructure so we can get to scale, get big, go fast, drive down costs. But there's also the other side of the value proposition, which is the benefit side. And I believe Simon and others captured that, which is there's a lot we can do on the policy innovation side and the market design. First, to ensure we have a common framework so that we can drive down cost, have a tradable market locally, regionally, internationally, and then on the benefit side to make sure that all the values of clean and green and decarbonized hydrogen can be compensated, accounted for, and tracked. I'll pause there.
Right. Okay. Brett, what are your views on this? How can this grant money, a finite pot of money, be used to stimulate broader market formation beyond what's accrued to the group of awardees?
No, I think it's a great question, Charles, because $8 billion, while it seems like a lot of money, is not enough to create a market. So DOE has some decisions to make. Does it invest in individual projects? How does it invest this money? Does it invest in creating a market and demand creation? So I just draw on some of the work that we did, 20 years ago when I was on the Public Utility Commission. And when we started down the path of electric restructuring, we put a framework in place. We had a set of incentives, and those have been talked about in the form of the LCFS, not so different from what we had with the RPS in Texas. And then we had to build infrastructure. And so we did that in Texas with a competitive renewable energy zone process. So we know how to do this. I think it's the same playbook that we've used over and over again. There are a few additional, I think bells and whistles that we need to add here. And that need to come along, to make this, to make this story complete. And some of those have been mentioned. The focus on the demand side. I think we probably need to spend a lot more time on hydrogen, focusing on who the customers are. And so we're doing a lot of work at the center in trying to understand end uses for hydrogen and who those early adopters are going to be. So that's one thing. We need to have a big vision. We need to have a kind of an architecture and a framework for what a market might look like. And while we don't know where the specific projects might be, just as we didn't know where the wind plants or the solar plants would go when we had CREZ, we did have an overall architecture for what the infrastructure might look like. So that's the second thing we need. And then the third thing, and I know Jason will talk about this, is that we need to talk about the benefits of these. We need to make sure the benefits of the infrastructure we're building are shared really across all our communities. And so I think we can start on the framework that we had, and we've been using, the playbook we've been using now for 20 years, and expand it to incorporate these additional factors which need to be taken into consideration. And then the last thing I'll say, and I'll put it in the chat, is we've been doing a lot of work at the center on this issue, and we just released a study, and I'll the link here for you guys to see. We've already been going down this path of creating these sort of items that I've been talking about with a group of over 70 companies and 100 subject matter experts to put together both the fundamental costs of what we think hydrogen will be in the Gulf Coast region, as well as a shared vision for what we want to see. So we started down this path, and I, in particular, was interested in doing this piece of work because of my experience as a former utility regulator and seeing the power of this kind of market formation activity that happened 20 years ago, and I believe can happen again, this time with the focus on decarbonization.
Thanks, Brett. And Jason, I want to go to you next, because any kind of strategy to build a market is going to involve local community involvement. It's going to, especially frontline communities who have been oftentimes left out of these kinds of developments, and the local workforce all need to be engaged somehow as part of these hydrogen hubs on the Gulf Coast. That's a critical question, but also even more specifically, we know that the hydrogen hubs need to show the Department of Energy that they have a justice strategy. And what exactly is a justice strategy? How do you view this? And beyond the fact that the Department of Energy requires one, what are other reasons to have a justice strategy? And how does that fit into the broader strategy that we're talking about?
Thanks very much, Charles. And let me just say to Janice and Brett, it's a great pleasure to be on this panel with you. I've used your organization's work products in trying to get up to speed on this sector myself. And so it's a real pleasure to be with you. I want to actually start answering that set of questions, Charles, with a concept that Brett, you just mentioned. And that was the concept that to make a market, you need a vision, right? Well, what's a vision? There are a couple things that go into, a vision. One is a frame, right? So what is a hydrogen hub about? What is it meant to do? How do we understand it? What is in the frame of a hydrogen hub? What's out of the frame of a hydrogen hub? That's very important to how people will respond to hydrogen hubs, and it'll create what the social side of a hydrogen hub will be. A narrative is also a really important part of a hydrogen hub market, right? Who does what for whose benefit, right? By when, under what rules? I was delighted to hear in the last panel a very rich discussion, I thought, on the importance of shared rules and regulatory systems. Not so much what those rules and regulatory systems need to be, but on the fact that they need to be, right, in order to provide order and coordination in actually existing markets. I think that's right. But I think markets have a social side and a cultural side too. And what we found in our study of the Gulf Coast as part of the Roosevelt Project, which which was led by Secretary Moniz, and which Charles and Ken both participated in. And thank you, gentlemen, again for that. I'll send a link to the full study. But what we found in that project was that a lot of the challenges of broader energy transition questions are not primarily technological or even economic. They're really primarily social and cultural. And our report tries to capture some of those. And so to your question, Charles, about what a justice strategy looks like, it's interesting to read the call for proposals from the DOE and see that these need to include an equity plan, a justice plan, an environmental justice plan. And I think, fortunately, there's a lot of the groundwork that's been laid here. The White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council has issued a recommendations report that has just a wealth of information in it about how to do environmental justice and which people are involved, and what some of the norms and ideas in that community are in the EJ community. It's just very, very helpful. And I think another advantage that this region has, in addition to the physical infrastructural advantage, right, is the social infrastructure that exists and the intellectual infrastructure that exists in the region. There are several important HBCUs in the region that have been doing environmental justice leadership and research for quite a long time. So I would certainly recommend involving folks there. Just one person who's in Houston is Robert Bullard, who's very well known in the EJ community. But there are many other institutions in the area too, including on the Louisiana side of the border that could be involved. Another one that I want to name specifically would be the HBCU CBO Gulf Coast Equity Consortium. It's a very long title, but I'll send you a link to that one too. But they've got a number of helpful resources, and so I would say, it's hard to encapsulate what a justice strategy would be in its entirety in a relatively concise response. And so, just as a last point, because I know I've been going on, I would say that the process is really critical, and it's essential in any justice strategy to include community groups, include people who are usually not included from the very beginning. And there are two very concrete benefits to that, even aside from the fact that DOE requires it, right, for these proposals. One is one has to do with the way people in the real world go about solving problems, right? One thing, we learn from social science is people are problem solvers. And it turns out that people in different communities face different kinds of problems and solve problems and see problems in different ways. And so you're likely to see different kinds of solutions and different framings of problems when you broaden out the engagement of leadership of a project to many, many different groups, right? That's number one. Number two reason, aside from the DOE requirements, is creativity. Where do good ideas come from? Good ideas come from connecting to organizations that are trying to solve some of the same problems that you're trying to solve, but in a really different way, right? And I think those two are kind of the core benefits to this sort of strategy.
And I tack on to that because I couldn't agree with you more. At the Green Hydrogen Coalition, we actually founded this nonprofit. We're an educational nonprofit that focuses on accelerating green hydrogen economies. And we've been working on hubs now for better part going on 3 years, working with community groups. And another benefit is sometimes what happens is the people and the cultural issues can trip up a project big time. And there's so many adages. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But the way we like to think about it is the vision that we're getting to, it's a system approach. It's not built on any one project. It's not even built on any one sector. It necessarily needs to serve users and off-takers across sectors. That involves so much infrastructure, so much projects, so much upheaval to how business is done as usual. And that vision needs to be co-created. And we always say that the fastest pathway, the whole point of this is to go faster, right? The fastest pathway to progress, to go from A to B, to achieving that vision, is the one that delivers the best business and community value proposition. There's a million ways to go from A to B, and the fastest pathway is the one that the local community stakeholders help to co-create and select. Do we choose this highway or that highway? We're going to have contraction in the oil and gas and refining business. What's the baseline of jobs? It's not enough to have training. What are the new jobs that this community is going to be placed into? And then just, to build on, there was commentary about the no regrets investment. I think some of that no regrets investment is not only the investment that enables early contracting and the signing and the development of assets, but it's also the no regrets investment that can restore local communities, that can have community support. And this is something that I think we're all innovating on, right? It's a new approach. And the other layer that's challenging, as we've come to discover, is that clean and green hydrogen is a new topic. I mean, the folks that are on this call have probably been thinking about it for a really long time, but some community groups, they're busy. They're working on a whole litany of other things, and it takes time to get on the learning curve. And the final challenge I'll mention is some of the issues, it's hydrogen, because it's so cross-cutting, it can bring up baggage, right? The groups that are involved sometimes have fought in the past, and we're uncovering litigation everywhere that's not related to hydrogen, it's related to something else. It's water litigation. And so creatively bringing groups together on a co-creative pathway that encouraged them to set aside some of this prior baggage and fighting is really hard, and it requires a special touch.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jason. I'll follow you up.
No, just it's so interesting. You raised the history point, right, Janice? I think a lot of the EJ groups in this community would probably call the baggage the history, and I think I would maybe pose that there are many different options, of approaching that history, right? One is to try to get groups to set it aside, for sure. I think I would be somewhat skeptical that that's going to work in the long term. I would actually recommend diving into the mess, and acknowledging and recognizing, the messy history that is real and that does exist, because what we found in trying to have broadly inclusive conversations in the study we did was that if one community has their deal breakers recognized, right, they're more likely to recognize the deal breakers of another side, right? For instance, for instance, if you're at a table, with environmental justice groups, and you acknowledge, the history of, disproportionate exposure to pollutants and the notion that, things, well, more than the notion, the evidence that things accumulate in the body, right? Then I think you'll be much more likely to get recognition for instance, a more industry-friendly perspective that might say, hey, there's demand for energy, there's demand for hydrogen, there's this economic opportunity that's being presented. Can we think about how to approach this? But you're right. I mean, these are super delicate issues, and this it's very thorny, conflictual terrain.
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that we would ignore that. You have to acknowledge the history, but the conversation about clean hydrogen cannot relitigate this litigation that's happening here. So it's carving out a respectful place. And I completely agree. It requires deep empathy and listening and seeing the issues. But you do need to create a safe place where you can co-create and go to this new blue ocean space, because the danger is, not handled properly, you could just get stuck. And so, yeah, but I completely agree with you. You have to acknowledge what's come before.
I think
Both of you
one thing I
made
would-
really good points about building this alignment, and it'll be an important part of the Gulf Coast area actually attracting the grant money to create a hydrogen hub, to demonstrate that they can provide that kind of alignment, address these difficult challenges, and prevent the hurdles on the front end to developing a market. Brett?
Well, I just wanted to pull up a couple of the comments in the chat and maybe integrate them into the discussion here. And I think one of the comments is, why the Gulf Coast and the need. I think Jason's paper does an excellent job of really, in quite a bit of detail, talking about the need on the Gulf Coast. Talks about both Louisiana and Texas, and how these communities, need to be engaged in the opportunity to use hydrogen as perhaps something transformative. And so I think, there is the need here to start to think about how do we, as Janice was saying, co-create this new market. The other thing I sort of wanted to pick up as a theme is this idea that these things, and there is a scarce pot of dollars, no question, but I don't think we ought to be looking at this as a competition between various regions. And I know just in all the discussions we've had, people are looking at, well, this versus that, Texas versus New Orleans, or Houston versus Louisiana, Texas versus Louisiana, the Northeast versus the Gulf Coast, or California. I think each of these has its own advantages, and I really do think the idea of this idea of thinking about how do we create a network of markets is where the real power of this is going to come from. And so we ought to be thinking not about this as a competition, but as a collaboration. And how do we all work together across the United States really to create what I think Congress's ultimate goal and DOE's goal should be, which is basically to create a national market for hydrogen. So just a little bit of a different framing of this on the national scale, and then I think a little bit of comments on why the Gulf Coast.
Very, very good point about building a broader market rather than segmented markets. And last question I want to lay out there for all of you. What lessons can the Gulf Coast learn from other regions in terms of low carbon industrial clusters, hydrogen hubs, and other types of hydrogen related activities? Clearly there are lessons to be learned out there. Could you maybe cover some of those?
Yeah, we're looking at Janice's work very closely. I think she's done some, as she mentioned, really great work in this area, and it goes back even longer than this. It goes back to work that she did in energy storage preceding this. So that, like I said, the playbook has been written before. We know what the playbook is. And so we are trying to learn in the work we're doing from work that's being done, not only in different parts of the country, but really around the globe. If you look at what's going on in Europe, and we've had a number of discussions with our European colleagues, as well as our Asian colleagues and folks from Japan and Korea. Just had a meeting with a Korean company this morning. Really, I think there's a lot to learn in terms of how we put these markets together. And I just think, again, on this idea of collaboration, we ought to be taking the best practices from around the globe and trying to incorporate them into the work we're doing, whether it's in Texas or California or Louisiana.
Jason, you probably had some thoughts on this, given the work you've done.
Well, I think there are many different lessons to be learned. I think the trick is always figuring out what were the necessary conditions for making a regional hydrogen market, successful in the early stages that we can't even really see because we only see it, in a handful of cases. I think it can be very tricky to adapt things. But the lesson that actually comes to my mind from other regions came from some reading I was trying to do on how EJ communities in other parts of the U.S. had responded to plans for hydrogen hubs, and I think there are a lot of back end concerns and back end debates that could really be headed off, if there's a more deliberate, way of including community members from the beginning. And so just as an example, there was a big debate in Los Angeles, at the city council over, nitrous oxide pollution from hydrogen blending on, why does it take, 9 kilograms of water for 1 kilogram of H2 when we're in the middle of a water shortage. What about volatility? What about explosions? What about methane leakage? And I think those, and obviously there are people who understand how these things work would have responses to all of those. But that's got to be a conversation that starts from pretty early days, instead of being left as kind of an afterthought or as a box to check.
Janice, you get the last word on this.
Well, our vision is to have truly a national clean and green hydrogen vision, and for clean and green hydrogen to be one of the world's most traded commodities internationally. And to do that, I think Brett said it well, we need a network of markets, and a network of markets that are interchangeable. And we need to collaborate like we've never collaborated before. And the foundation, even some of the most basic pieces of this, interconnected network of markets is not yet set. And I would say if there's one recommendation that we would have for the Gulf Coast is let's at least harmonize on an appropriate carbon intensity framework. And I know DOE is looking at this right now. The GHC is of the opinion, and we are joined by many other industry groups and environmental groups, that a well-to-gate carbon intensity framework is absolutely essential to having the right foundation. That's like the first building block. From that, there are so many other legal and regulatory building blocks that need to be put into place. And, just thank you, Brett, for mentioning our history on the storage space. We're letting the market applications in the world be our guide of how to prioritize it. So in the early days of storage, we built an application framework which defines how, say, a battery device is to be used and how you stack benefits. And in the hydrogen case, it's more complex because you have to look at the many ways it's produced, the energy sources to produce the hydrogen, and then ultimately how it's used. And it can go into multiple sectors. So this interesting tangle of which infrastructure and which compliance mechanism, because is very complicated. And so we're attempting to write that guide and then share it with all of you. And hopefully we can all harmonize on a correct underlying framework and then let competition take over. So that would be my recommendation. And of course, in doing this, we cannot ignore the imperative to make it a clean and just transition, that how we move forward, as Jason said, it must involve local communities, especially the communities who've suffered the most.
Janice, Brett, Jason, thank you for this terrific discussion and your brilliant insights on this. And with that, we are out of time for this panel, and I'm pleased to turn over to the moderator of the next panel, Lisa Francis.
Thank you very much. I'm Elisa Francis, a partner at Guidehouse, and I am leading their decarbonization initiatives around e-mobility, hydrogen, and renewable energy technologies. I am looking forward to today's session on the role of current and potential hydrogen off-takers. I mean, there's been a tremendous discussion about the supply side of hydrogen, and obviously the DOE, the bipartisan infrastructure law that passed last year. We've got the 8 billion in the hydrogen hubs. We've got another 500 million roughly for clean hydrogen manufacturing and recycling, another billion going into R&D for electrolyzers. But one of the things I recently completed in Guidehouse, we led a hydrogen consortium of 22 companies where we brought companies together to brainstorm ideas around pilots or potential hubs across the US. And we developed business cases for those opportunities. And one of the things we heard at the completion is many of them were very interested, had really solid plans for pulling the hydrogen hubs together or the pilots, but they wanted the certainty that Brett was talking about. And they wanted to ensure that the demand and the offtake was going to be there for those potential projects. And that's, to me, one of the key things that's missing. And one of the things I'd like to start our panel in discussion today would be essentially looking at, what are the key things that are impeding hydrogen demand specifically? Is it the lack of supply? Is it cost? Is it the regulations? Is it the weak market signals that we're seeing? I think we touched on a little bit of all of that in some of the earlier discussions. But what I'd like to do is introduce very briefly the panelists that we have, who are terrific. We have Brad Markle, who's the executive director of the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Council and the Working for American Institute. We have Hunter Johnston, who's a partner at Steptoe and Johnson that has a leading practice that's focused on carbon sequestration, renewable energy, and decarbonization policy. He's also, by the way, a partner at Lake Charles Methanol. And then Ramanan Krishnamurti, who is the Chief Energy Officer and Professor at the University of Houston. So we've got a great group. I'm going to just begin to just hand it over. Brad, I think, why don't you kick us off on this first question around sort of the impediments to the demand? Because the demand really is critical, I think, for moving and creating sort of this hydrogen economy that we're all trying to move toward. And what insights do you have in terms of the policy side or any other barriers that need to be addressed that you can comment on?
Well, thank you, Lisa. It's great to be here with everybody, and thanks to our friends at EFI for the invitation to participate. Hydrogen is a hot topic in the labor movement, as you might imagine, and for the reasons that we see it helping preserve a lot of jobs as we move to a lower carbon economy. And we see some transformational possibilities for new industries to use hydrogen that haven't been using hydrogen, been using other forms. So when I think about offtake, I think, there are two big categories. One is people who are already using hydrogen, know how to use hydrogen, want a cleaner hydrogen supply. And chemicals, refining. When we talked to DOE about hydrogen skills, and some people maybe got a little excited about, oh, we're going to have to start from scratch. We had to remind them, no, we've been, using hydrogen in refineries for a long time. There are a lot of workers who go to work every day and work with hydrogen. I think part of the exciting part for labor and about this market development is, what are we going to do to extend the use of hydrogen to places where it hasn't traditionally been used before? Where can, and I think about steel making, for example, where for a long time, boy, we would say, you got to have a blast furnace, you're going to have to capture the carbon. Fuel switching is rising in the potential in steel making, right? A lot of what would have been 5 years ago a discussion about carbon capture could be a discussion about fuel switching now. You see the mill up in Sweden that is using green hydrogen. So for each of these segments, the question to me is around, okay, what is the business case for their use of hydrogen? And therefore, what kind of agreement can they reach, right? So if you want to do tolling, but you can't take the risk of where's the water going to come from, or if I want to do blue, but I can't take the risk of what is happening to that carbon after it leaves my facility? Those are very tough discussions if you're in a cyclical business, as opposed to say power or fuel, where you kind of realize what your demand is going to be. So to me, those decisions around what kind of agreements, how the market develops, have to drill down into those two categories. Who's using hydrogen already and what kind of changes they're looking for in their supply. And then very, very importantly for us, because we think about preserving these jobs in clean fuels, where we're not going to be taking molecules apart, we're going to be putting molecules together. What's the steady state demand there? Cement, so on and so forth. So these decisions, I think, are going to be really different for really different end use customers. And maybe there's not, it's not an either or. Maybe there's some hybrid kind of contract that hasn't really been worked through yet, say compared to LNG. So maybe take or pay or offtake, that way versus tolling. Maybe that's not the only choice, but there are some smart lawyers, I think, who maybe could help figure that out.
And Ramanan, before we get into the types of agreements, tolling versus take or pay, what are your thoughts in terms of the key barriers that are out there for creating demand?
So I think, the biggest barrier is obviously cost, right? And green hydrogen today is just too expensive. And I think that's part of, at least in North America, right? Again, Europe is a different story. We saw that in the chat. It might be a very different story in Europe today compared to North America. I think that's perhaps our biggest challenge. But then, on the demand side, I think, and really coming back to address some of what Brad was talking about, there is a massive opportunity to really expand what we're doing in fuel switching. And the idea of being able to switch natural gas with blended hydrogen with natural gas. 85 BCF a day of natural gas put into pipelines. If you do 10% switch, that's 8.5 BCF of hydrogen. That's 7.7 million tons of hydrogen a year, right? And so that's double what our current production in the Gulf Coast is. It's about comparable to what the US produces today in hydrogen. That's a real opportunity. 10% switch, it's known to work. We've addressed a lot of the safety related issues. That's an opportunity that's right away present and can be done. And it has a huge impact on our greenhouse gas emissions. 180 million tons.
No regulations to allow. I think we're just getting a little feedback from someone's line. You can mute. And Ramanan, just quickly, so you talked about some technical issues, but on the incentive side, one of the things we kept hearing in our consortium was the importance of the production tax credit and other incentives to help stimulate that demand. What do you think will do that on your end in terms of, encouraging people to do the blending or the fuel switching?
So, part of it is we've already got an incentive for companies to start looking at fuel switching, because you're starting to want to reduce your scope 1, scope 2 emissions. And this is going to play a big role in sort of as we start to blend in hydrogen, that can start to really reduce your scope 1, scope 2 emissions. That, along with the price on carbon, I think starts to really drive the most significant sort of impediments to do the simplest switches. And I think we really want to pick the lowest hanging fruit. And I think that's really this idea of fuel switching.
So Hunter, I'm going to turn over to you if you can unmute your line too. At Guidehouse, we understand that the LNG market obviously has used tolling agreements. They've used take or pay contracts. And I think our position on hydrogen really is that because it's so dependent on feedstock, that maybe tolling agreements are probably the appropriate path there, because there is so much commodity risk when you're looking at take or pay contracts, and you'd have to deal with that. And we're aware that the recent DOE loan guarantee program with the Intermountain Power Plant used tolling agreements and is moving in that direction. And I'm just curious, in terms of your perspective, what is being used now maybe for gray hydrogen? And do some of those arrangements or structures that are being used for gray hydrogen apply to clean hydrogen, green hydrogen? What are your thoughts?
Well, thanks for the opportunity to participate in this panel. And thanks to EFI and Secretary Moniz. The key characteristics of bankable offtake contract for production of hydrogen is similar in structure and content to project financing of other major chemical projects such as LNG, methanol, or ammonia. LNG contracts do offer some of the best examples of large chemical financings that have been done on a project finance basis. In a typical LNG tolling deal, customers pay for the reservation of liquefaction tolling capacity. And these customers are responsible for sourcing their supply of natural gas and then pay the LNG facility a charge based on processing of the LNG. That's one type of an example of what could be done in the hydrogen space. And an alternative to that is that the project developer model, wherein the project developer pulls together all the elements of procurement of natural gas, construction, electricity generation, and then you rely on a formula-based price with a minimum price and take or pay guarantees embedded in contract terms. And this is what we would expect to have seen in the recent. I know in the prior panel we heard about the Air Products transaction and their relationship with the Gulf Coast ammonia project finance. So in all those arrangements, it's vital to have the contract counterparties with strong credit to support contractual obligations. The classic case in project finance are power purchase agreements with U.S. utilities backing contractual obligations to purchase electricity from developers. Of IPP, we've seen that in the case of wind and solar. These types of arrangements are particularly useful where hydrogen production is to be used for storage of electricity when renewable energy exceeds the needs of the balance of the grid. Another example is where hydrogen is to be used as fuel for transportation and sold to large public transit entities with acceptable credits. One of the biggest factors in structuring those types of contracts is the requirement by lenders that there's a sufficient reliable off-taker commitment for the quantities of hydrogen produced. And hydrogen is not a commodity that is easily transported unless you have a pipeline or sold as a commodity without prior arrangements in place. And there's no spot market for hydrogen. Then another whole element of this is, of course, these financings have to be supported by strong EPC arrangements, providing lump sum turnkey contractual terms with scheduled performance guarantees, shifting construction risk to credit supported, by the EPC firm from the equity and debt underpinning the transactions. Other than those types of contractual terms, we could see joint venture investment models also. Those types of investment structures are maybe more appropriate where there's an end-to-end investment in the production of hydrogen and its use. And there's a recent announcement in Louisiana by Olin Corporation, which is from Missouri and with the presence in the Baton Rouge area. They signed an agreement with New York-based Plug Power to produce green hydrogen at a facility, chloralkali facility in St. Gabriel, which is going to produce 15 tons a day of green hydrogen by 2023.
Raman or Brad, do you want to comment on the type of arrangements that you think might be ideal for green hydrogen or clean hydrogen?
So, now the big way that it gets done, as Ken mentioned previously, it's about bilateral contracts, right? So pretty much I produce, I supply, you take, you're done, right? And that's and single maker, single user type of contracts are where we are today. I think that's going to change fundamentally as we start to broaden the use of it. We're going to start to look at significant demand pool, and that demand pool will fluctuate. And because of the early days in this, I think the take or pay model is likely to be the one that's going to perhaps move forward. If we don't learn from our history with take or pay, will be to our own detriment, right? And we know what happened to the natural gas market back in the 60s to 80s. 60s, same issue. lack of demand, where's the natural gas going to go? Take or pay was the model that was used. Pipeline companies didn't pay close attention to take or pay clauses. And back in and when it got to the 80s, they paid heavily and heavily because natural gas prices dropped dramatically. We can almost anticipate the same thing happening with hydrogen. Hydrogen prices will drop, especially low carbon intensity hydrogen prices will drop significantly from today. So as we start to look at clean hydrogen economies, because of fluctuations in demand, take or pay seems to be the most likely model, but huge cautionary note, right? How we structure those long-term take or pay is going to matter.
Yeah, I mean, because I think how do you deal with the commodity risk that's in the take or pay contracts too? I think that's going to be key. And Hunter, I don't know, or Brad, if you've got thoughts on that, risks of costs or risks of the renewable energy not being cheap.
And I think on the how cheap is the renewable energy, we're going to be in pretty good shape in 5 or 10 years. That's not really the thing. One of the things that I think we worry about is the risk around water. We don't discuss water usage enough. Those of us in the work energy policy know that water usage is a big deal. We start talking about green hydrogen. Maybe in some places there's plenty of water. In California, as was mentioned at the LA City Council discussion, that was a very drawn out discussion. And so that's a commodity risk for the people doing offtake, right? And this is where I think, we're in this place where we don't have spot markets. We don't have well-developed markets. We're hoping for regional markets where DOE and the hydrogen activities, not just the 8 billion, but the full suite. They've got a $9.5–10 billion loan program office, whatever money, we're going to need in the future from Congress. We're going to have to somehow cross this valley and get to a place where we can have spot markets, where we can have a very diverse user base. And I think that the path there will help drive the structure of these contracts.
And Hunter, how about your thoughts? Because the managing the commodity risk is going to be key if we do go this path of the take or pay contracts. Any thoughts on how that could be structured?
Yeah, they're going to need to have formula pricing with a pass through on the commodities, because if you're talking about project financing, whether it's the loan office or commercial banks, they're not going to take commodity risk on a project. So it's got to be passed through. That's the model for what's been successful at the loan program. This is what the model for success is with respect to financing of LNG projects. And I would just mention that, the recent example of the Gulf Coast ammonia project, which has this deal with AP, is project finance. It's backed by Starwood Energy and Mabineft. And though they have long-term supply agreements from AP, the details of those agreements are private. They're not public, but I'm told that on the ammonia sales, which is a project finance again, they have long-term supply agreements with minimum price guarantees. So, especially at a time with high natural gas prices, and that, whether we're talking about green or blue, we're still going to have commodity risk with respect to electricity or natural gas. And with recent price of natural gas having spiked, there's no way that the banks or the equity investors are going to take that kind of risk, especially because the return for the competition for investment is keen, and equity investment are going to require certain parameters for return that mean that they're going to require not only for the capital invested and operations and maintenance and feedstock to be passed through, but they're going to want to return on their profit on their investment in that formula pricing.
So would you pick a tolling agreement over the take or pay contract? I mean, the Intermountain kind of moved more in the direction of a tolling agreement. I think Ramanand's probably focusing more on take or pay type of arrangement. I'm curious, Hunter,
Well, it just depends on how the market develops. I mean, I didn't address your first question, but one big question is what is the premium for green hydrogen, and what is the cost of the feedstock? remember in the LNG context that we go back to the Cheniere deal, which was the basic construct for which, LNG projects became financed. It was a $3 MMBTU toll, but it was based on Henry Hub pricing. So if you could tell me what green hydrogen is going to be, what the compliance requirement might be in the market, what the price for that is, then I could, you can project finance if you know what the price of sale is going to be and using the tolling agreement. Otherwise, you're going to have to do it in reverse and use formula pricing. So I think that, frankly, the challenge on for hydrogen, your first question was quite appropriate because it's really about what is the price of blue or green hydrogen in the market, to make and particularly, we could talk about the other chemicals that use hydrogen like methanol and ammonia. If we have a common measure for what those products, what they are in the market, what that premium is, then these, whether going on a tolling agreement or a formula-based pricing, either one could be successfully project financed.
Well, let me ask, if let's also add in if there's a global trade market, right, for hydrogen or even ammonia as a carrier, how might that impact the type of arrangements that we've been talking about? Does that change your answer in any way?
Sure, changes mine.
Ramadan, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, changes mine. If you start to get a global market and think you start to look at methanol or ammonia, then tolling probably makes a lot more sense because then you're tied to a commodity price through your power purchase agreements for your electricity that sort of drives your electrolysis process, and then the tolling to convert to methanol and then trade methanol or toll to ammonia and then trade that. And I think that changes a lot. I'm thinking local. If you think your local demand, that's a different answer. If you're thinking global and export is a big part of it, we're going to need a carrier. Liquid hydrogen seems a little too far at this point in terms of the technical challenges and the amounts that we could do. Ammonia, methanol, much higher energy carriers, more likely to go the tolling route.
Right, and most of the growth in demand in the Gulf Coast is in fact for methanol and ammonia. And if you look globally, one of the most interesting things that are happening is the decarbonization of shipping and the potential demand for low carbon fuels such as methanol or ammonia that can play as a substitute for bunker fuels. And Maersk and other companies are sort of leading the charge and looking for low carbon fuels. And that's going to be a big part of the role that the Gulf Coast hydrogen production can play. Meaning that new demand from the emissions trading system and mandates from RED II in Europe.
Go ahead, Brad.
These fuels and shipping and perhaps in aviation are going to provide some of the best new markets. I really want us to encourage to think about how all these incentives line up inside of changing regulatory structures where there are low carbon fuel credits, where we could look at pricing, we can look at state mandates. There are a lot of things that are going to shape the guardrails for this market, and everybody that's thinking about investing, I think, is going to think very carefully about what that looks like, not now, but what's the 10, 20-year outlook for those kind of policies.
And I'll just add one more thing to that, Lisa, on the policy side. I think this issue that we heard earlier from the Green Hydrogen Alliance, the Green Hydrogen Coalition, about this carbon intensity framework. I think that's going to dictate everything that Hunter spoke about with marine as we start to look at the carbon footprint. Being able to come back and have a standard framework with which we can account for that carbon intensity is going to be front and center, the biggest challenge we face.
Hunter, do you want to add anything there? Or I think we've got time for one last question.
I just want to agree with Raman on that. I think that a common system of measurement of carbon intensity, it's vitally important for the global market, but it's also very important for things like, the leading policy that's creating blue fuels in the United States is a Section 45Q tax credit. And on the utilization side, we don't have, those rules are still being figured out as to how you measure carbon intensity. Yes, it says do a life cycle analysis, but it doesn't set where the boundaries are. So for each of these commodities, we need a framework, much like what's in California, the LCFS, where they actually have a schedule of products and a carbon intensity value that is associated with those products, and then a market that gives you a premium for selling those products into that market.
So we only have a couple minutes left. Any final takeaways you want to share with the audience? Any lessons learned from contract arrangements in Europe or globally that might be good insights to bring into the US or Gulf discussion as well? Ramanan, I'll start with you.
So I think I want to go back one question back, Lisa, and to the question about demand. And I think one of the things that we heard about, which was where's the biggest opportunity? And I think the biggest opportunity for the Gulf Coast especially is in the area of heavy duty transportation, being able to create a network on heavy duty transportation. I don't think we covered that enough today. There's an incredible opportunity between San Antonio, Dallas, Houston, where there's an incredible amount of heavy duty freight transportation that could really benefit from a strong hydrogen supply, and perhaps the biggest opportunity to create demand there. And when you start to look at a green hydrogen demand there, that's an incredible opportunity. And I think that's the part I think we can learn from places like Rotterdam, places like the UK, where they've really tried to construct these local environments, these microgrids, if you will, for hydrogen demand.
Thank you very much. Excellent point, Ram. Hunter?
I would just pick up where Hunter left off and really note the importance of the ancillary investments around 45Q, infrastructure, permitting, whatever tax credits we can gin up around electrolyzer production and so on. What are we going to do around processes with steel, processes with cement to make those affordable? What are we doing, inside the fence in the petrochemical complexes? All those ancillary investments are what's going to help drive a big volume uptick in this market. So while we look a lot around hydrogen and the DOE's goals, I think we have to have a bigger picture about how this is going to develop, and otherwise it's just going to, it will get there, but it just takes too long, and we need to pull this forward as fast as we can.
Thank you. And Hunter, last.
I would just more specifically, perhaps on pricing, if there could be an index for hydrogen that is similar to what Henry Hub is for natural gas, that could do more than almost anything else to drive investment and price certainty for project developers.
Well, thank you all so much, Brad, Hunter, Ramanan. This is really an excellent discussion. I'm going to now pass it over to Secretary Moniz for the fireside chat.
I'll try again. Thank you, Lisa. And once again, a very interesting panel indeed. We've had 3 of those. And I agree with, for example, the comment that Ramanan made towards the end that, and yet there are many, many topics. You mentioned heavy duty transport, for example, that we haven't even gotten to yet. But nevertheless, it is my great pleasure to turn to a chat with a great friend, Mary Landrieu, who, as you all know, served as senator from Louisiana. And she's had a distinguished set of activities in both the public and private sectors. And so I think she can help shed some light on the whole issue of public-private partnerships in particular. I will say that I've never forgotten, Mary, the helicopter tour you took me and some colleagues on to the Mississippi Delta region. It was harrowing for 2 reasons. One was the open door to improve visibility, but the other was seeing some of the major work that needs to be done environmentally, seeing the opportunities for industry, seeing the issues of communities that needed to be served. So I think a lot of the topics that were discussed today kind of were all encapsulated in that one thrilling helicopter ride. But let me turn to you. As we've said, obviously, you served in the Senate for some time, and you served on committees that addressed energy, economic development, innovation. And the first question is just to hear your thoughts on how that background leads you to think about the possibilities of hydrogen market formation more broadly and in the Gulf specifically.
Well, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for leading this effort. And I've listened the whole morning to all the panels, and I gained so much more understanding and insight. So I thank all the panelists. It was wonderful to see several good friends, and Colette Honorable, who served so beautifully on FERC and helped lead a lot of these policy discussions during her time. And of course, I've worked closely with Hunter Johnson over many, many years. And his father, who served as chair of the committee before I did. So thank you all for it, including me. And Ernie, I'll only say I was very happy that you did not.
Just to be clear, that would be Bennett Johnson.
That would be Bennett. That would be Bennett Johnston. Yes, sorry, Bennett Johnston, who served as chair for many years of the Energy Committee. And help lay so much of the foundation for actually what we're talking about today. So Ernie, I'd also say I was glad you didn't fall out of the helicopter, because I would have been held responsible for that. Losing a Secretary of Energy would not have been a very good report back to my colleagues in Washington. But I also want to give a shout out to our Clean Hydrogen Futures Coalition. You know, I'm a senior advisor at Van Ness Feldman, and we created this Clean Hydrogen Futures Coalition years ago, led by a great partner in our firm, Shannon Angelski, who's been doing a lot of this groundbreaking work that everyone has talked about. You know, from a policy perspective in Washington with our regulatory agencies, as well as with our members of House and Senate. Just a couple of sort of high level takeaways, and the last panel really focused on this is, you know, Mr. Secretary, I think we would be, as a coalition or as a collaboration, better than a coalition, a collaboration, you know, well advised to be colorblind and focus on the carbon intensity. And thinking about the fact that hydrogen is being produced now, 95% of it is being produced, you know, in this Gulf of Mexico region from natural gas. We have a real opportunity, as many have said, in this particular region, because the expertise is here. This is mature technology. And if we could really focus on the carbon intensity and have our goal as eliminating carbon, minimizing carbon, that would help us. I also want to give a shout out to John Bell Edwards, whose name hasn't come up. And the reason I want to bring his name up is because he is the only governor in this region that has committed the state of Louisiana to a net zero, you know, carbon future. And he put together an amazing group of industry and civic and community leaders and express these goals, and of course is paving the way for companies like Air Products, which was speaking earlier, and the $4 billion investment that they're making. And then, you know this, Mr. Secretary, from your time and your expertise, but our geology in the Gulf Coast for storing carbon, you know, or just our natural geology, is also quite superior from what I understand. We may not be the only area in the country, but we clearly are, you know, one of the leading areas. So with, you know, the expertise that we have here with our workforce, with the geology that we have, with the pipeline infrastructure that we have, focused on carbon intensity and a sort of a colorblind approach, I do think there's a lot more work to do in developing the policy at the federal level and in the market structures, but there's some real opportunity. So I'll stop there and be happy to answer any questions or thoughts, or, talk about a specific point that you might want to focus on in this closing.
Oh, that's great. But I'm going to start calling you Senator Landrieu unless you relent. Anyway, yeah, going back to your service on the Energy Committee in the Senate, what are your thoughts in terms of how effective for promoting hydrogen the infrastructure bill is? What do you see as possible additional legislative directions that could be particularly helpful for the Gulf Coast, but also in general for promoting hydrogen?
Well, I mean, I think the big picture, and maybe the elephant in the room, is that there still is unfortunately, a strong segment of the broader community that doesn't want have anything to do with fossil fuels. They don't want it to be part of the transition. They are insisting on a future, without fossil fuels, instead of, I think, a smarter approach and a more cost-effective approach and a more sort of, everybody put your shoulders to the wheel kind of respectful approach, and figure out how the oil and gas industry, particularly the natural gas industry, with all of our thousands and thousands, if not millions of miles of pipelines, can be part of this cleaner transition. And so instead of focusing on, the fuels, focus on the emissions. And I'm very happy to hear about the things that California is doing in that regard exactly, and creating the kind of markets. They're sort of agnostic when it comes to the technology, as long as the goal is low carbon or the fuel is low carbon, however you can get there. So what does Congress have to do? Clearly, there needs to be some acceleration of pipeline permitting, an acknowledgement that some of these right-of-ways have already been established. And we've been talking with many of our clients about this. And of course, it's a big discussion in Washington. It's got to be a little bit more fulsome than the FAST Act, which was just reauthorized and made permanent under the infrastructure bill. But some sort of regulatory clarity, modifications to the way that pipelines are regulated, particularly when they start blending hydrogen. I think establishing some additional, credits. I think one of the leaders, I think it was Brad, said, for Congress to really think about additional credits and incentives for new technologies related to cement production and steel production. That could be very helpful. Regulatory clarity, Mr. Secretary, about whether FERC has this jurisdiction or PHMSA. I think it's not, shouldn't be PHMSA there for safety of pipelines, but to clarify that FERC has the authority here for the establishment of hydrogen pipelines. And people mention investments without regrets. If the government is making investments, then I think there's a public interest in making sure you're making those investments with as broad a scope as possible. But the private sector makes investments all the time, and sometimes those investments don't work out. Sometimes they do. But the pipeline companies that I'm speaking to have the money and want to make the investments in this new infrastructure. There's a lot of private money in this world that they're ready to make the investments with the right signals from Washington. And then the permitting storage issue, the primacy for Louisiana. One thing that wasn't mentioned that I want to mention now, and I'm sure you all are aware of it, but there's a very robust discussion on a border adjustment mechanism, and still a lot of backroom discussion on pricing carbon or price on carbon in some kind of way with a border adjustment mechanism. That would immediately create some exciting opportunities, whether that's going to happen now or sometime in the near future. So I know, and you all know as well, because you're in this space, everyone that's listening in and tuning in and being a part of this, there's a lot of discussion in Washington about this new, hydrogen economy and building on, not eliminating the natural gas industry, but building on what the industry has done and continues to do for this country. And then the opportunities for maritime and long haul trucking. That was, I don't have to repeat that. That's another opportunity for the hydrogen market. So I just think the next couple of weeks between now and August are going to be really interesting and exciting to see what, Joe Manchin can negotiate with Democratic caucus and with the House and with the White House, lay down some of this framework, get these tax credits extended, 45Q, the hydrogen PTC, which in my view could be improved, but it's, between 45 cents and $3 right now. It seems like it's acceptable to most. Yeah. So, I am very excited and bullish, Ernie, on what the future looks like if we can just stop villainizing the industry and being more respectful of talking with the current, and I mean industry broad, oil and gas exploration, pipelines, chemical companies, big agriculture, be respectful. Last 100 and so years, 200, 150 years, and work with them in partners to transform our economy to a low carbon economy. I think we're moving in the right direction.
Well, Mary, you've you've triggered now a whole bunch of questions. But first, I think you already answered this, but let's be very explicit because I think it's important. Colette, Honorable, obviously raised the issue of needing statutory authority to kind of clean up the regulation of hydrogen when it becomes a large energy commodity. She didn't quite say, and it should be FERC, but I think you did. Is that a correct reading?
Well, I think it needs to be an agency that's under the jurisdiction of the Energy Committee and, in that space, as opposed to in transportation. I guess I could debate that or not debate, but I could be persuaded a different way with a stronger argument. But FERC seems to have the ability to, I wouldn't say they always do it as well as they should. I think we should all move a lot faster with everything that we're doing. But I don't know if there would be an option. But clarifying that, and then mostly expediting the pipelines that are necessary to create the hydrogen, or to accelerate the hydrogen economy, is very, very important. And modifications to the way NEPA is applied. If you start building a pipeline, and I'm 99% sure I'm correct about this, if you start building a pipeline and you lay out a path for a pipeline, let's say it's 300 miles long. If you deviate from that path by, I don't know, maybe it's 20 feet, 15 feet, 50 feet, 100 feet, I don't know, but deviate from the path, you have to go back and start your whole process again. That makes absolutely no sense. There are common sense steps that can be taken to expedite, pipeline using, expedite pipeline construction in this country. And I think, unfortunately, to be very honest, and maybe this is a little provocative, but, stopping pipelines has become, the left wing, attack against the industry. And instead of attacking the industry, we need to be working with the industry in a smart way to expedite the elimination of carbon from the atmosphere. And it's not just, Ernie, in our country. Everybody's focused on the US. If we don't stop China from continuing its, pollution, building new coal power plants, or figure out what to do in India, you know this better than anyone from your work as our secretary, you can diddle at the margins in the United States of America all day long and miss, the global targets by miles. Mm-hmm. And so we've got to ease up a bit on the nitpickiness in, I think, the US that's going on. Not that we don't have to get methane out of the process and capture methane, and the industry can do that. They've never been required to do it. They're willing, many in the industry, not everyone, there are some laggards, but the industry really wants to step up, get that methane out of the system, and use it productively if possible. And if not, store the greenhouse gas, store it.
Well, I guess,
Sequester it.
yeah, I have to say, I will take that as a yes on FERC.
Yes, you
That's what
can.
I heard. I will also just observe that going back to my time at the Department of Energy, that as you well know, I think the federal organizational chart does have a dashed line between FERC and the Secretary of Energy. And my statement was always that I always saw the black parts of the dotted line, and the FERC chair always saw the white parts. But anyway.
Well, I know they're independent, but I know they're independent, and that's appropriate, but they do have to follow, of course, the congressional rules and regulations that created them and sets their responsibilities. And Congress really needs to evaluate that and decide. And frankly, with this invasion of the Ukraine, Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and some of the steps that Europe took to move too quickly to only wind and solar, leaving a lot of things on the table, closing their nuclear power plants, I think potentially prematurely, leaving themselves vulnerable now to a limited supply and high prices. I just don't think that's where the United States should be going. And clearly now that we can see clearly with our own eyes what happens, and we need to think of a clean path, an affordable path, but not a dangerous one that puts our country in economic jeopardy or national security jeopardy.
Well, I think everyone agrees that that we clearly need to address the regulatory gaps for a major hydrogen commodity world, and I think that connects to something else you noted, in effect, saying that right now there's a lot more private capital available for clean energy projects than there are investable projects, and I think that regulatory move would be at least one of the steps needed to improve investability in this area, but it's needed across the board. So let me change subjects, especially I'm worried about, oh my God, the time is already, we could go on, but certainly Jason and Brad, et cetera, also emphasized the issue of kind of social justice, jobs, job stability, and you've emphasized the importance of continuing some of the natural gas activities and cleaning it up with sequestration or some other routes as well. What's your reflection, particularly in the Gulf area, in terms of how different pathways could influence that question of job retention and continuity, and using the existing skill sets of the workforce?
Well, earlier on this morning, someone said it beautifully, that the Gulf Coast is beautifully positioned for this transition, and we just need the right signals and the leadership, which is arising very, very quickly. Houston is doing a great job. I think while the state of Texas has been a little bit mum in their policies, the city of Houston and some of the counties have been really leaning forward. John Bel Edwards in Louisiana, and Democrats and Republicans are doing this together. We know that our region has the geology, we have the water, we have the workers, we have the technology, we have the pipelines, we know how to permit quickly. That's probably why, I don't know, 90% of all the LNG exporters are somewhere on the coast of Texas or Louisiana, because we can flat build these facilities and get folks to work, and we know how to do it. We're not afraid of it. We are just used to moving a lot of just manufacturing and building a lot of this energy infrastructure already for the country. So we want to be part of the transition, and that's a just transition to me. The workers down here are not multimillionaires. I mean, they are Black and white and Hispanic, and they are working people, and they have a right to an 80 and 90 and $100,000 a year job. You know, lots of these folks from, you know, our part of the world came out of literally the agricultural fields, and I'm talking about white and Black and Hispanic, into these factories where they were able to buy a house, put their kids through school, generation after generation. This is not something we want to throw away. Now, on the other side, there have been examples where some communities, poorer communities, have not been respected as well as they should have been, with maybe facilities being built too close to neighborhoods or too close to schools. But sometimes that land was cheaper. The factories were there to begin with. And then people moved in because the land around them was less valuable than maybe the country club land. So, I mean, you've got to be careful before you cast stones at who was there first, second, third, or fourth. All I can tell you is in the Gulf of Mexico, we are proud of America being an energy powerhouse. We want it to be a clean energy powerhouse. We believe in new technologies, and we believe in the good old American spirit to create it, not just walk away from assets and hope and pray that, you know, the windmills are strong enough to power the earth. They will maybe one day, they're not now. The battery technology, we can't put batteries, you know, this large and large enough to move trucks. We have to think of ways to move our ships and our big trucks and our industrial base to help what Joe Biden wants to do, which is to create jobs and opportunity in America. And realize the problem, while America has our problems with carbon emissions, Ernie, it is nothing compared to what is happening in China and India right now and their projections for the future. So that's what I would say as chair of the Energy Committee. I'm no longer chair, but it's a global challenge, but the Gulf Coast is up to do our part.
Well, Mary, I see we're already over time, but I want to summarize, I think correctly, and you correct me if I haven't, I think a very important point that you made, and that is when you referred to the discussions of Senator Manchin and Murkowski and the White House and et cetera, I believe what you said is, in effect, that the core difference that has to get negotiated revolves around this question of, do you focus on the emissions or do you focus on the fuels?
Right.
Would that be?
And we need to focus on
summary?
the emissions.
Yeah.
That's where we need to focus, and let the market, with the right incentives, we've got to have some tax credits and production tax credits and appropriate, government policies. But let's focus on the emissions, and America could be just the world's leading clean energy powerhouse, using the great asset of American natural gas and our know-how and our scientists represented here on this call, you being one of them, and get to work. So yes, you heard me correctly.
Okay, good. I happen to agree with you.
Thank you.
Well, look,
Well,
Mary,
and I'm very proud to agree with you, because I think you're a very respected voice in this space, Ernie. And, I just wish people would, we're wasting so much time fighting, and we just have to, I think, unite around the goal, which is the lowest carbon intensity, cleanest source.
Mhm.
Stop trying to pick winners and losers, let the market move. And it could do that much better if Congress would set a price and a border adjustment, but that's a whole nother story. We know that. Whether they'll do it now, they're going to do it eventually, whether it happens now or in a year or two from now. Whether the Democrats will get the credit for doing it or the Republicans, I don't know. But whoever does it is going to get the credit for moving this country so quickly, much more quickly than we are. And let me just say one last thing. Well, that's all I'll say. I'll leave it at that. Okay.
And I would just add the footnote that I think the carbon border adjustment, of course, needs the carbon pricing to come along with it. So that'll be.
Yeah, you can't have, it really doesn't
Right.
make sense to have one
Right.
without the other, and they're different
Exactly.
versions. You know, I'm not the expert, but
Right.
there are different versions and we can figure out what's the best. But this is America's time and we can do it, and hydrogen's a big part of it. So thank you all for
Great.
everything that you're doing.
Well, thank you, Mary. This has been a great discussion. I wish we had more time, but we don't. In fact, we have used up my 5 minutes of closing remarks. But I don't mind that. I would just note that we've covered a lot of ground in this hour and a half. I have a whole list of important subjects from the various panels and from this discussion. I would just then end by thanking everybody again for taking part. And a lot of people took part. We must have, I don't know, 60, 70 chat entries, which to me is like a record for this kind of time, showing the level of interest. And so again, thank you all. And we will try to summarize all of this, as I said at the beginning, summary of this workshop. Lot to take into account. So thank you all. And I think with that, we're going to sign off from this workshop. Thank you.